The farm sat in a low bend of the Red River, where the water curled around the bottomland like a sleeping cat. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. Now, picture that bend in the river. Picture the soft brown water moving slow under a sky the color of pewter. Picture the cane brakes shivering along the banks, the wild grapevines climbing the sycamores, the cornfields running flat and gold toward a dark line of oak woods. This was Robertson County, Tennessee, in the early part of the 1800s. The land here was rich and damp. The soil turned black under a plow blade. Tobacco grew tall as a tall man, and the air in late summer smelled of warm leaves and sweet river mud. In that bend of the river, a family named Bell built a farmhouse out of squared logs. The house was simple and sturdy, 2 stories tall, with a stone chimney at each end and a wide porch that faced the road. Inside, the floors were broad pine planks, worn smooth by bare feet and boot heels. A spinning wheel sat in the corner. A long table held a tin lantern and a Bible bound in cracked leather. From the front door, you could see the cornfield slope gently down toward the trees, and beyond the trees, the slow brown shine of the water. A family lived here. A husband, a wife, and a house full of children. They were plain farming people. They raised hogs and cattle. They went to church on Sundays in a little log meeting house not far up the road. They knew their neighbors by name. They prayed before supper. They slept with the windows cracked in summer and the shutters closed in winter. And for many years, nothing strange ever crossed their door. And then, sometime in the autumn of 1817, something did. Nobody is sure exactly when it started. Some say it began with a strange animal in the corn rows, a thing that looked like a dog, but moved like nothing the family had ever seen. Some say it began with a single knock against an outside wall, late at night, with no wind to explain it. Others say it began quieter than that, a scratching in the dark, a small sound like a mouse, but not quite, something patient, something listening back. Whatever it was, it grew. It grew slowly at first, the way a cold creeps into a room when the fire dies. Then it grew louder, bolder, and stranger, until the Bell family could no longer pretend they were imagining things. Until the neighbors came to listen. Until grown men sat up all night in that farmhouse with rifles across their knees, waiting to see what the dark would do. Until, by some accounts, a future president of the United States rode up the lane in a wagon, curious to meet the thing in the Bell house for himself. What happened in that bend of the Red River between 1817 and 1821 has been told and retold for over 200 years. It has been written down in old manuscripts and printed in old books. It has been argued about in churches and laughed about in taverns and whispered about by candlelight. Folks who lived through it swore on the Bible that every word was true. Folks who came later swore it could not have been. And still, no one has ever fully explained what visited that farm. Some call it a witch. Some call it a spirit. Some call it a trick of the mind, a piece of frontier loneliness gone wild. Some call it the most thoroughly documented haunting in all of American folklore. The name that has clung to it for 2 centuries now is the Bell Witch. That is the mystery we will sit with tonight. Not in a hurry, not all at once. We will walk it slow, the way you would walk a country lane at dusk, listening to the cicadas wind down and the whippoorwills start up. We will meet the Bell family as they were before any of it began. We will follow the strange sounds into the walls. We will hear the voice when it finally spoke, and we will sit at the table where General Andrew Jackson is said to have eaten supper, and then gone hurrying home. For now, hold that picture in your mind. A farmhouse in a bend of a slow river. A lantern in the window. A cornfield breathing in the dark. And somewhere, just beyond the firelight, something waiting to be heard. Picture Robertson County, Tennessee, in the early years of the 1800s. The land rolls in soft green waves, dipping down to creeks lined with sycamore and willow. The Red River curls through it like a lazy brown ribbon, slow in summer, swollen and gray in spring. Cornfields stretch in long, patient rows, broken up by patches of dark woods where the oaks grow thick as church columns. The sky out here sits low and wide, with clouds that drift like sheep across blue pasture. This is the country John Bell came to in 1804. He came down from North Carolina with his wife Lucy and a wagon full of children. He came looking for soft soil and quiet days. He found both near a tiny settlement that would one day be called Adams. Back then, it didn't have much of a name at all. Just a few cabins scattered along the dirt road, a mill turning by the water, a meeting house where folks gathered on Sundays. John bought 1,000 acres of good bottomland. He cleared it with his own hands and the help of his sons. The trees came down one by one, and the smell of fresh pine sap hung in the air for weeks. He raised a 2-story log house with a wide porch and a stone chimney. The boards were rough-hewn, and the floors creaked under boots, but it was solid. It was the kind of house built to last 100 winters. By 1817, the Bell place looked like something out of a quiet dream. A red barn stood off to the side, dark as dried blood against the green fields. Smokehouse out back, where hams cured in sweet hickory haze. A spring house over the cold water, where milk stayed sweet through July. Chickens scratched in the dust. Hogs rooted in the woods. Somewhere on the property, a slow brown cow with a brass bell around her neck wandered the pasture, the soft clank following her wherever she went. The bells were not rich, but they were comfortable. John had 9 children by then, though one had died young as children often did in those days. The rest filled the house with noise and movement. There was John Jr., the oldest still at home, tall and serious. There was Drury, called Drew, quiet and watchful. There was Jesse and Zadok and Richard Williams, the boy who would one day grow up and write the whole strange story down. And there was Joel, the baby of the boys. And then there was Betsy. Elizabeth Bell, who everyone called Betsy, was the youngest daughter. 12 years old in 1817. A bright-eyed girl with chestnut hair and a quick laugh. She wore long calico dresses and went barefoot in the warm months, her feet brown as river stones. She helped her mother with the spinning wheel by the front window, where the wool came off in soft white clouds. She gathered eggs in a wicker basket. She played with the dogs in the yard. She was by every account, an ordinary child in an ordinary house. Lucy Bell was the soul of that house. Folks who knew her said she was gentle as morning light. She kept a clean hearth and a full table, and she sang hymns while she worked. Her voice drifted out the open windows in the evenings, mixing with the cricket sound from the field. Neighbors loved her. Strangers trusted her on sight. John himself was a man of the church. He served as an elder at the Red River Baptist Meeting House just down the road. He read scripture by candlelight in the long evenings, his finger moving slow across the page. He was respected in the county, known as honest and steady, a man who paid his debts and kept his word. The world they lived in moved by lamp and lantern. After sundown, the only light was the orange glow of the fireplace and the small yellow flames of tallow candles. Shadows danced on the log walls. The wind made the wooden shutters rattle. Outside, the dark was complete, a thick country dark where you could hear an owl call from a mile away. That was the Bell Farm in the autumn of 1817. Corn stalks rustling in the cool wind. Pumpkins ripening on the vine. Smoke curling from the chimney into a sky full of stars. A plain family in a plain house, doing the plain work of frontier life. And somewhere out in those dark fields, something was already watching. Something the Bells had not yet seen. Something that would, before long, walk right through that solid front door. The story really begins with a man walking through his own cornfield on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1817. His name was John Bell, and by then he was past 60 years old. His hair had gone the color of pewter. His shoulders were wide from 40 years of clearing land, and his hands looked like roots pulled up from the ground. He wore a homespun shirt the color of weak tea, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and trousers held up by a single strap of cracked leather. John walked his fields every day after the noon meal. It was his habit, the way some men take a pipe after dinner. He would step between the rows of corn, which by midsummer stood taller than he did, and he would listen to the long green leaves rustle like paper above his head. The smell of warm dirt rose around his boots. Sometimes he carried a hickory stick. Sometimes he carried nothing at all. On this particular afternoon, John stopped walking. Up ahead, between two rows, something was standing in the path. It looked, at first glance, like a dog. A big one. Black, maybe, or the deep brown of river mud. But the shape was wrong. The legs were too long. The head was the head of a rabbit, with tall ears that swiveled toward him. The eyes were the eyes of something else entirely, and they were looking right at him. John lifted his rifle. He always carried it slung across his back in those days, the way a farmer carries a tool he expects to need. He aimed steady. He fired. The animal did not fall. It did not run. It simply was not there anymore, the way a candle flame is not there once you blow it out. The corn around the empty spot stood still. No leaves moved. No footprints marked the dirt. John stood for a long minute with the smell of black powder hanging in the air, and then he walked home and said nothing about it to anyone, not yet. To understand why he did not speak, you have to know the man. John Bell was a Baptist deacon. He sat in the front pew of the little log church at Red River on Sunday mornings, and he sang the hymns in a low voice that the other men followed. He did not drink whiskey. He did not gamble. He did not tell tall tales by the fire the way some of the neighbors did. When John Bell said a thing, the thing was true, and everyone in Robertson County knew it. His wife was named Lucy Williams Bell, and she was, by every account that survives, the gentlest woman in that part of Tennessee. She wore her brown hair parted plain down the middle and pinned at the back of her neck. Her dresses were simple cotton, gray or pale blue, with a white collar she washed every Saturday. She moved through the house quietly, always with something in her hands, a wooden spoon, a basket of mending, a baby on her hip. People who knew her said her voice was soft as moss. They also said she never spoke an unkind word about anyone, not even the ones who deserved it. Together, they had raised 9 children on the farm, though by the summer of 1817, only the younger ones still lived under the cabin roof. There was Drury, tall and broad-shouldered like his father. There was John Jr., quieter than the others, who liked books better than plows. There was Richard Williams Bell, just a boy of 6 that year, who would one day grow up and write down everything he remembered. And there was Betsy. Elizabeth Bell, called Betsy by everyone who loved her, was 12 years old. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's straight backbone. She wore her hair in 2 braids that fell past her shoulders, and her dresses were always a little too short because she kept growing. Betsy ran where other girls walked. She climbed the apple tree behind the smokehouse. She knew the names of every cow in the pasture. She had a laugh that the neighbors said could be heard from the next field over. That afternoon, John Bell came back to his cabin and washed his hands in the basin by the door. Lucy looked up from the bread she was kneading. She saw something in his face, the way wives do, but she did not ask. He hung his rifle on its pegs above the hearth. He sat down to supper with his family. The cornbread steamed on the table. The lamp had not yet been lit because the sun was still high. Outside in the cornfield, the rows stood quiet. Nothing moved, nothing at all. Life on the Bell farm moved the way life moved on every farm in that part of Tennessee. Slow, steady, set to the turning of the sun and the shape of the seasons. Before the strangeness came, before the knocks and the whispers and the long nights of wonder, there were just days. Plain, good days. The kind that smell like wood smoke and biscuits and rain on cedar shingles. The bells woke before the light. John always rose first. He would step into his boots by the bed, pull his coat from a peg by the door, and walk out into the blue dark of the yard. The grass was wet under his soles. The chickens shuffled in their coop, soft and chuckling, waiting on him. He carried a tin pail to the spring house, where the cold water ran clear over flat stones, and the milk crocks sat half buried in the chill. The morning air had a clean bite to it, sharp as a new knife. Lucy Bell came next. She lit the kitchen fire from the banked coals, blowing on them gentle as a prayer, until the orange bloom caught the kindling. She set the iron skillet on the hook and started the meal. Cornmeal, bacon, coffee dark as river mud. The smell of it climbed the stairs and pulled the children from their beds one by one. Drury Joel, Richard Williams, who they called Williams, little Betsy with her sleep-tangled hair and bare feet on the cold pine floor, house itself was a sturdy thing. 2 stories of squared logs chinked tight with clay, set under a steep roof of split shingles. Inside, the walls were planed smooth and whitewashed. There were rag rugs on the floors and quilts on every bed, sewn from scraps the women had saved for years. Patches of butternut brown and indigo blue, and the soft red of madder root. A tall clock ticked in the front room. A long table sat in the kitchen, scarred from 1,000 suppers, polished smooth by elbows and forearms, and the slow press of years. Outside, the farm stretched in every direction. Cornfields that ran in long green rows down toward the bottoms. A tobacco patch that smelled in the curring season like molasses and old leather. A smokehouse heavy with hams hanging from the rafters. A barn where the horses stamped and blew steam into the cold. The woods began at the edge of the cleared land, dark and tall, full of oak and hickory and beech. Beyond the trees, the Red River bent slow through the lowlands, brown and unhurried. The days had their shape. Morning chores, breakfast around the long table, Lucy passing the platter, John saying grace in a voice low and even. Then the men and boys to the fields, the women to the kitchen and the garden and the wheel and the loom. Betsy fed the chickens with a wooden bowl on her hip, scattering the corn in a wide arc, laughing when the rooster ran sideways at her ankles. The hounds slept in the dooryard, long ears flat in the dust, one eye open for squirrels. At noon the bell rang and everyone came in. Cold ham, cornbread, buttermilk from a stoneware pitcher. The men ate quick and went back out. The afternoon stretched. The shadow of the house leaned east, then longer, then long enough to touch the fence. Evening came on like a slow tide. The cattle drifted up from the lower pasture on their own, knowing the time better than any clock. Supper was the gathering. All of them at the table, lamps lit, the windows full of soft black. Lucy might read from the Bible. John might tell a story about something he had seen in the fields. The boys would argue over small things. Betsy would yawn into her hand. The fire would settle and pop. Outside, the night sounds began. Crickets in the grass, a whippoorwill way off in the trees, the river moving in its bed, talking to itself. Then the lamps came down low. The fires got banked for the night. The children climbed the narrow stairs, candles cupped in their hands, the small flames bending and straightening with each step. Beds creaked, quilts pulled up to chins. Outside, the wind moved in the oaks with a sound like distant water. This was the world before. A house full of plain people doing plain things, under a Tennessee sky that held nothing strange yet. They had no idea what was coming. The knocks had not started. The walls were just walls, and the long, patient nights still belonged only to the wind and the wood and the slow turning of the stars. The knocks went on for weeks, and the Bell family learned to live with them the way folks learn to live with a leak in the roof. You stop hearing it after a while. You stop turning your head. The dogs barked less. The children went to bed without asking what made the rapping on the logs. John Bell stopped walking the porch with his rifle. Lucy Bell kept her sewing in her lap by the fire and hummed low under her breath, as if her own song might smooth the strange evening down. But something in the house was learning too. Something was watching how the family slept. It started in the small bedroom where the younger Bell children slept 2 and 3 to a bed. The room sat at the back of the cabin, away from the big hearth, and in winter, the cold pressed against the chinking like a hand looking for a crack. The quilts on those beds were heavy. Lucy had pieced them herself from old shirts and feed sacks, stuffed thick with carded wool, and the children pulled them up to their chins each night and slept under the weight like stones under river water. One night in the deep part of winter, little Richard Williams Bell felt his quilt move. It was a slow pull, not a tug, not a yank, a long, even draw, the way you'd peel a wet leaf off a stone. The quilt slid down his chest, down his belly, down past his knees, and gathered itself in a soft heap at the foot of the bed. Richard lay there in his nightshirt, with the cold air finding every inch of him, and he did not move. He was 7 years old. He listened to his own breathing. He listened to the wind in the cedars outside. He listened for footsteps and heard none. He pulled the quilt back up. He tucked it under his arms. He squeezed his eyes shut. The quilt slid down again. This time he heard it, a soft dragging sound, like cloth on cloth, slow and patient. He felt the weight leave him inch by inch. When the quilt reached the foot of the bed, it settled there in a little hill, and the room went still. Richard opened his eyes. The moon was up, and a pale square of light lay on the plank floor by the window. The room was empty. His brother slept beside him, breathing soft. The door was shut. No draught moved the curtain. He pulled the quilt up a third time. He held the edge of it under his chin with both small hands. He waited. Something pulled. He felt it through the cloth. A steady, careful pressure, the way a fisherman draws in a line. His knuckles whitened. The quilt tightened against his grip, and then, gently, as if whatever held it did not want to break him, the pull eased. The quilt stayed where it was. Richard lay shaking under the wool, listening, his heart loud as a barn dance in his chest. In the morning, he told his mother. Lucy Bell knelt by the bed and smoothed his hair and said, "Hush now, you were dreaming." But she looked at the quilt heaped at the foot of the bed, and she looked at the latched door, and she did not say anything more. That same week, Joel Egbert Bell, who was younger still, woke in the night to find his pillow gone from under his head. He sat up in the dark and felt around the bed and found the pillow on the floor, 3 feet from where he'd laid down. The window was shut. His brother was asleep. The dog had not stirred. Then Betsy, 12 years old, the only daughter still small enough to share the back room. Betsy woke one cold morning before dawn with the quilt pulled clean off her body and folded, neatly folded, on the chair across the room. Not dropped, not tangled, folded the way her mother folded laundry, the corners square, the edges even. Betsy sat up in her thin nightdress and stared at that folded quilt in the gray light, and something in her face changed that morning and did not change back. The Bells gathered in the kitchen that day around the long pine table. John Bell stood at the head with his hands flat on the wood. Lucy stood by the stove. The children sat in a row. Nobody ate. Nobody spoke for a long time. Outside, the Red River ran slow under a skin of ice, and the cedar woods stood quiet, and the smoke from the chimney climbed straight up into a sky the color of pewter. Inside, else had begun to choose. Word travels strange in a small town. It moves slower than a horse, but faster than the wind, passing from porch to pew, from kitchen window to barn door, gathering shape as it goes. By the spring of 1818, the people of Adams knew something was happening out at the Bell place. They did not know what to call it yet, but they knew enough to lower their voices when the name came up. The general store sat at the crossroads, a low building of weathered pine with a tin roof gone soft and rust-colored from the rain. Inside, the air smelled of cured tobacco, molasses, and the sharp tang of new leather. Men gathered around the iron stove, even when the weather warmed. They leaned on barrels of flour and traded what they had heard. One man said the Bell girl had been struck on the cheek by something no one could see. Another said her hair had been pulled so hard she dropped to her knees in the yard. A third man only shook his head and spit into the ashes. Betsy was 12 then, a slim girl with dark hair and quiet eyes, the youngest daughter of John and Lucy Bell. The neighbors had always known her as polite, sweet-mannered, a child who curtsied at church and helped her mother with the bread. Now folks said she walked with her shoulders drawn in like a deer at the edge of a clearing. They said she startled at her own shadow. They said the marks on her face came up red as crab apples and faded by morning, leaving nothing to point at and nothing to prove. The older women had ideas. They sat on the long benches outside the church on Sunday morning, fans moving slow in the still air, bonnets tied tight under their chins. One remembered a place down in Kentucky where a family heard footsteps in their loft for a full year before they packed up and left. Another spoke of her grandmother back in the Carolinas, who said certain spirits attached themselves to young girls the way honeybees attached themselves to clover. There was something in the blood, the old women said, something about the age. A girl on the edge of womanhood drew things the way a candle draws moths. The men at the tavern had cruder theories. Some said John Bell had cheated a neighbor years back in a slave trade, and the wronged party had cursed the family through a conjure woman down by the river. Others said the land itself was bad. The Cherokee had buried their dead in that ground long before the white settlers came, and you could not plow over a burial without paying a price. A trapper named Eli claimed he had seen lights moving along the riverbank at night, pale and slow, like candles carried by something walking just under the water. The Methodist preacher rode through every other week. He listened to the stories with his hat in his hands and his mouth set in a thin line. He told the congregation to pray harder. He told them to read scripture aloud in their homes. He told them that the devil was a roaring lion who walked about seeking whom he might devour, and that fear itself was the open door. The people nodded. Then they went home and bolted their shutters anyway. Children at the schoolhouse whispered behind their slates. They said Betsy had stopped laughing. They said her brothers walked her home now, one on each side, like guards around a flag. One little girl swore she had seen Betsy's bonnet lift clean off her head in still air and float for the length of a breath before falling to the dust. The teacher hushed the talk and rapped the desk with her ruler. But the teacher's own face went pale when she said it. What the locals agreed on, without quite saying it, was that the trouble had a center. The knocks came in every room of the Bell house, but the worst things happened wherever Betsy stood. The blankets pulled from her bed, the slaps that left her cheek burning, the sound of small bare feet padding across the floorboards beside her at night. Whatever this was, it had chosen her, and the people of Adams, plain farming folk who knew the difference between a barn owl and a banshee, began to speak the old word in low tones at the edges of their conversations. Witch. They did not mean a woman in a black hat. They meant something older, something that came up out of the ground or down out of the trees and settled on a household like frost on a window pane. They meant a thing without a face, and they meant a thing that had now found a name to follow. For a long time, the thing on the Bell farm did not speak. It tapped. It scratched. It pulled at quilts in the dark like a child too shy to show its face. The Bells had grown used to those small frights, the way a person grows used to a leaky roof or a wind that whistles through a loose pane. But sometime in the second year, somewhere in the long quiet of 1818, the thing in the walls found its voice. to understand what that meant, you have to step back from the farmhouse and look at the land itself. The Bell Place sat on a slow bend of the Red River in a part of Tennessee that was wild not long before. Cane grew thick along the banks, taller than a man on horseback. The hills rolled soft and green, dotted with sinkholes and limestone caves that opened into the dark like mouths in the earth. Mist gathered in the low places at dawn. The whole valley felt older than the people walking on it. And it was older. Long before John Bell drove the first nail into the first board of his cabin, this country belonged to other people. The Chickasaw hunted here. The Cherokee passed through on long trails worn smooth by generations of moccasins. Before them, the Mississippian peoples had built towns and mounds across these river valleys, raising earth into shapes that pointed at the stars. Some of those mounds still stood in Robertson County when the Bells arrived. Soft green humps in the fields, quiet as sleeping animals. The old stories say this land was full of spirits, not the kind a preacher warns about, something gentler and stranger. The Cherokee spoke of the Unwetsunsty, the little people who lived in the rocks and the caves and the deep woods. They could be kind. They could be playful. They could turn a man around in the forest until he wandered for days in a circle no wider than his own barn. The Chickasaw had their own tales of voices in the trees, of things that whispered through the cane at dusk. Every people who ever walked this country brought stories home about what they heard in the dark. The settlers brought their own ghosts when they came. Scotch-Irish families like the Bells carried old beliefs across the ocean in their bones. They believed in second sight. They believed in fetches and warnings, and the thin places where the living world brushed up against something else. They believed death could be foretold by a knock on the door at midnight, or a voice calling your name from an empty field. When John Bell heard the first scratches on his cabin wall, some part of him already knew what kind of story he had stepped into. The cave on the property mattered too. Down a steep bank, hidden by sycamores and grapevine, an opening in the limestone led into a long, cold throat of stone. The Bell children played near it. They tossed pebbles into the dark and listened for the small, wet sound of water far below. Caves like that one had been sacred to the people who came before. Bones had been laid in them. Offerings had been left. Some of those caves held drawings on the walls older than any written word in this country. Whether the Bells knew it or not, they had built their lives on top of a place that had been listening for a very long time. So when the voice finally spoke, it did not feel like an invasion. It felt like an answer. A faint whisper at first, the family said, soft as a breath against the ear, like someone trying to remember how to use a tongue. Words came slow and broken, then clearer still. By the end of that winter, the thing in the walls could carry on a full conversation. It could quote scripture. It could sing hymns in two voices at once. It could mimic the laugh of a neighbor who lived 3 miles down the road. Folklorists who studied the case later pointed to this moment as the strange hinge of the whole story. Most hauntings stay quiet. Most stay in the realm of bumps and chills. The Bell Witch crossed a line that almost no other American ghost ever crossed. It spoke. It argued. It joked. It told its own history sometimes, though the history kept changing. Some said the voice was something the old land had been holding for centuries, waiting for the right ears. Some said it was something the Bells had brought with them, knit into the family by old country blood. Nobody could prove either one. The voice only kept speaking, night after night, into a valley that had heard stranger things before. By the autumn of 1818, word had spread far past the bend in the Red River. Folks in Springfield knew. Folks in Nashville knew. Travelers riding the old post road would stop their horses just to ask the way to the Bell farm. And John Bell, tired as he was, did not turn them away. He believed that more eyes might mean more answers. So the front room of the cabin filled, night after night, with men in muddy boots and women with shawls pulled tight around their shoulders. Among them came a small group of neighbors who decided to do what nobody had yet done. They decided to question the thing, not pray at it, not run from it. Just sit by the fire, ask it plain questions, and see what came back. James Johnson was the first. He was an older man, calm as still water, with a long gray beard and a Bible always tucked under his arm. He sat in the rocking chair by the hearth and spoke into the empty room as if speaking to a guest. The voice answered him. It came from the air above the table, soft and clear, like a woman speaking from the next room. And what it said that night sent a long quiet through the house. It said it was a spirit. It said it had once lived. It said it had been buried in the woods nearby, and its bones had been disturbed. James Johnson asked where. The voice gave a place, deep in the trees, past the south field. Men went out with lanterns the next morning to look. They found nothing. No marker, no grave, just leaves and roots and the smell of wet earth. When they came back and told the voice it had lied, the voice laughed. A small, dry laugh. Then it told another story, a different name, a different grave, another search, another empty hole. This went on for weeks. The neighbors began to keep notes. Some wrote on scraps of paper. Some kept small leather books. They wanted to catch the spirit in its own words. They wanted to find the seam in the story. But the seam kept moving. One night, the voice claimed it was the ghost of an Indian buried under the hill. The next night, it was a child who had drowned in the creek. The next, it was the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, a living neighbor who had quarreled with John Bell over a hog sale years before. 4 different names, 4 different histories, 4 different reasons for being there. And then, on a cold evening in late November, the voice changed its tune again. It said it was not one spirit at all. It said there were 4 of them. 4 ghosts sharing the same air, taking turns at the same mouth. One called itself Black Dog. One called itself Mathematics. One called itself Cypocryphy. One called itself Jerusalem. The names made no sense to anyone listening. They sounded like words pulled from a half-remembered dream. The neighbors looked at one another across the firelight, and nobody knew what to write down. Were they 4? Were they 1? Was the thing playing with them the way a cat plays with a piece of yarn? A man named Frank Miles, big as a barn door and afraid of nothing, came one night to test the voices himself. He sat in the middle of the room and asked each name to speak in turn. And each one did. Each had its own way of talking. Black Dog was rough and low. Mathematics was prim and proper. Cypocryphy whispered. Jerusalem boomed. Frank Miles left before dawn. He never came back. The investigation, if you could call it that, gave the family nothing solid. No bones in the ground. No name that held up. No reason that lasted longer than a night. The neighbors went home with their leather books full of notes and their heads full of fog. Some decided the thing was a demon, wearing different masks to confuse them. Some decided it was a single spirit lying for sport. Some decided it was many spirits, tangled together like roots under a stump. And some decided, quietly, that it was something nobody had a word for yet. That is the trouble with the Bell Witch. The harder you look, the more shapes it takes. The more questions you ask, the more answers it gives, and none of them match. The fire would burn down. The neighbors would file out into the cold. And the voice, whoever it was, whatever it was, would still be there in the rafters when the door shut, waiting for the next visitor, waiting to tell a new story. By the autumn of 1818, the voice on the Bell farm had grown into something almost ordinary. It spoke from corners, from rafters, from the dark space behind the butter churn. The neighbors came in twos and threes, hats in hand, boots wiped clean on the porch stone. They sat in the warm kitchen and waited. And the voice, when it came, was clear as a church bell on cold air. One night, James Johnson, a deacon from down the road, asked the question that nobody had yet found the courage to ask. He spoke softly. The way a man speaks to a horse he does not want to spook. He asked the voice who it was. He asked it for a name. There was a long pause. The fire popped. The dogs outside lifted their heads. And then the voice answered, calm and bright as a girl reciting her lessons. I am a witch, it said. My name is Kate. Old Kate Batts. Kate Batts was a real woman who lived not 3 miles from the Bell farm. She was a widow with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. She and John Bell had quarreled once over the price of a slave, and she had not forgotten. The neighbors looked at each other across the kitchen table. Nobody spoke for a long while. James Johnson later told his sons what he remembered of that night. He said the voice did not sound cruel when it named itself. He said it sounded almost pleased, the way a child sounds when it finally gets to tell a secret it has been holding. He said the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and apples, and the moon outside was the color of skimmed cream. He said he walked home that night by the river road, and he did not look back once. Frank Miles, a big man with hands like split oak, came to the farm not long after. He had heard the stories, and he did not believe them. He sat in a straight-backed chair by the hearth, and he set his jaw. Frank told his neighbors later that he had come to the Bell house ready to fight a man, or two men, or three. What he was not ready for was a voice with no body. The voice greeted him by name. It told him what color shirt he had worn the Sunday before. It told him a private thing about his brother, a thing only family would know. Frank Miles sat in that chair for a long time. When he stood up to leave, he was a quieter man than the one who had walked in. He told his wife, when he got home, that the world was bigger than he had thought. He said it the way a man says it when he has been humbled and does not mind. Calvin Johnson, the deacon's son, was younger then, maybe 16. He spoke about that winter all his life, and he never changed the story. He said the voice would sing sometimes. Hymns mostly, the slow ones, the ones they sang at funerals. He said it sang in a sweet alto, like a woman in the back pew. He said the strangest part was not the singing itself, but the way the singing made you feel. Not afraid, not even surprised. Just still, he said. Just very, very still. Calvin remembered one evening when the voice asked the children to tell it about their day. Betsy talked about the schoolhouse. Joel talked about a fox he had seen by the creek. The voice listened, and then it told them a story of its own, something about a road far away and a house with a blue door. Calvin could never recall the story exactly, only the feeling of it, like listening to your grandmother before sleep, he said, like being warm under a heavy quilt. The real Kate Batts, when she heard what the voice had called itself, was furious. She walked the 3 miles to the Bell farm with her bonnet strings loose and her face the color of brick. She demanded the spirit stop using her name. The voice, by all accounts, only laughed. A small, polite laugh, like a girl behind a fan. Nobody knows why the spirit chose that name. Some said it was mischief. Some said it was a clue, pointing at an old grudge that had soured into something darker. Others said names are just sounds, and the thing on the Bell farm needed a sound to wear like a coat. What the witnesses agreed on was simpler. The voice was real. They had heard it with their own ears, and nothing in their lives ever felt quite the same again. Word of the voice spread the way smoke spreads through a forest. Slow at first, then everywhere at once. By the autumn of 1818, the Bell farmhouse had become something stranger than a home. It was a meeting place, a waiting room for the impossible. The neighbors came in wagons. They came on foot. They came on horseback down the muddy roads that wound through the cedar groves and the bare brown fields of Robertson County. Men in long coats and stiff black hats. Women with shawls pulled tight against the early frost. Children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide as silver dollars. They tied their horses to the split-rail fence and walked up the gentle slope to the porch, where John Bell stood greeting them like a tired minister at a church door. The farmhouse itself looked plain in the gray afternoon light, a simple two-story structure of hand-hewn logs and whitewashed clapboard, small windows, a stone chimney rising from each end. Smoke curled up into a sky the color of pewter. Inside, the rooms smelled of wood ash and beeswax and the warm yeast of fresh bread. Lucy Bell kept the kettle going. She fed every soul that crossed her threshold, because that was what Tennessee folk did, even when the visitors had come to hear a ghost. And the ghost did not disappoint. The pattern of it was what struck the neighbors hardest. The voice always came after dark, always when a fire was lit and the lamps were burning low. It would start with a whisper, like wind in a chimney flue. Then it would grow steady and clear, filling the room as if a fifth or sixth person had pulled up a chair. Folks who had ridden 10 miles to scoff went home pale and quiet. Folks who came expecting tricks left swearing. They had heard the voice quote whole passages of scripture, word for word, in a tone soft as falling snow. Calvin Johnston told one story. James Johnston told the same. The Gunn brothers told it again. 2 farms over. A traveling preacher named Sug Fort came down from Springfield and added his own version. And here is where the pattern starts to rhyme in ways that make folklorists lean forward in their chairs. None of these men were friends. Some had never met. They lived on different roads, attended different meeting houses, kept different hours. Yet their stories matched in the small details. The voice spoke first from the northeast corner of the room. It addressed people by name, even strangers it had never been introduced to. It knew what they had eaten for breakfast. It knew the scripture they had read that morning at their own kitchen tables, miles away. That last detail kept appearing, over and over. A neighbor would arrive, and the voice would recite the exact verse he had studied at dawn. One man, it was said, had read from the book of Luke before saddling his horse. The voice quoted Luke back to him before he had taken off his coat. Another had read from Matthew. The voice gave him Matthew. The pattern held with a precision that no traveling magician could fake, because no traveling magician could have ridden ahead to every farm in the county. Dates began to line up too. The early manifestations followed the harvest moon. The voice grew strongest in the cold months, quietest in summer. The poundings on the wall came most often between midnight and the rooster's first call. Witnesses who lived 20 miles apart noted the same hours, the same days of the week, the same lulls. Some who came to listen believed they were hearing an angel. Some believed they were hearing a demon. Some believed they were hearing the lost soul of an old woman named Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John Bell had quarreled over a land sale. The voice had taken that name for itself, after all. Kate, just Kate. But other listeners came away with a different theory entirely. They believed the voice was nothing supernatural at all. They believed it lived inside Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, 12 years old, pale as paper, often present when the strangest things happened. They thought the voice was her sleeping mind speaking aloud, somehow, in ways nobody could yet name. Both ideas circled the farm like crows around a winter field. Neither could be proved. Neither could be put to rest. And the neighbors kept coming, night after night, because the only thing more frightening than an unanswered question is the suspicion that the answer might be standing right beside you, smiling, holding a cup of tea, watching the fire burn down to embers. Now we come to the heart of it. The strange thing that turned this story from a curious haunting into something the people of Adams would whisper about for the next 200 years. Because the spirit that called itself Kate did not stay content with knocks and pulled blankets and small mischief in the dark. She turned her attention to one man, and that man was John Bell himself. It started, by most tellings, in the late summer of 1818. John was in his middle 50s then, a tall man with a long face and a quiet manner. He had worked the Tennessee soil with his own hands for nearly 15 years. His neighbors knew him as steady, honest, and slow to anger. He was not a man given to fancy or weakness. But that summer, something began to change in him. It happened first in his mouth. John was out walking his fields one afternoon, the corn standing tall on either side of him, the air thick with the smell of warm earth and ripening leaves. The sun was low. The shadows ran long between the rows, and without warning, his tongue began to swell. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. His jaw locked up tight as a stuck door, and his tongue pressed against the roof of his mouth like a piece of swollen wood. He stumbled back to the farmhouse. By the time he reached the porch, the spell had passed. His tongue settled. His jaw came loose. But he stood there on the wooden boards, pale and shaking, with no idea what had just happened to him. The episodes came back, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice in a day. His face would twitch, his mouth would jerk to one side, and often, when these spells took him, the family would hear that low, laughing voice in the corner of the room. Kate, they said. Kate was doing this. The voice did not hide her feelings about John Bell. She called him Old Jack. She said she meant to torment him to the end of his days. She said she would not rest until he was in the ground. The family heard these threats spoken plain, in front of witnesses, in the warm yellow light of the kitchen lamps. Visitors heard them too. Grown men, men who had fought in wars, men who had stared down panthers in the canebrake, sat in that house and listened to a disembodied voice promise the slow death of their friend, and John began to wither. That is the word the old accounts use. Withered. He grew thin. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands, once strong enough to split oak from sunrise to sundown, began to tremble when he lifted a cup of water. He took to his bed for long stretches. He would rise, try to walk the porch, and feel his legs go soft beneath him like wet rope. The fits got worse. Sometimes his whole face would seize up, frozen in a strange, twisted shape, and the family would gather around him helpless, watching, listening. And from somewhere just above his head, or near the bedpost, or out in the dark hallway, Kate would laugh. A soft, mocking laugh, like wind through dry corn husks. Doctors came from miles around. They rode up the dirt lane on tired horses, satchels heavy with the medicines of that age, dark bottles and powders and tinctures of mercury and laudanum. They examined John. They listened to his chest. They looked into his clouded eyes, and one after another, they walked back out to the porch and shook their heads at Lucy Bell. They had no name for what was happening to her husband. They had no cure. There were theories, of course, even then. Some said John had suffered a stroke, the kind that creeps slow and steals a man piece by piece. Some said it was a sickness of the nerves, brought on by the constant strain of the haunting itself. A man cannot live for months inside a house of knocks and whispers without his body paying a price. Others, the believers, said it was Kate, and only Kate, that her hatred was a real thing, a slow poison poured into him night after night, and that no doctor could ever cure a wound made by a spirit. The family watched. The neighbors watched. The voice in the dark made her promises, and John Bell, the steady farmer at the bend of the Red River, grew thinner and grayer with each passing week. Whatever Kate was, whatever she wanted, she had chosen her target, and the whole valley could see her closing in. Old Jack Johnson was the kind of man people listened to without him having to raise his voice. He lived a few miles down the road from the Bell place, on a small farm tucked between two low hills. His beard was the color of river fog, and his hands were rough as oak bark from 40 years of plowing red Tennessee dirt. He read his Bible by lamplight every night, and he carried it with him the way other men carried a rifle. When word reached him about what was happening at John Bell's house, he set down his coffee, put on his good coat, and walked out into the cold. The evening he came calling. A thin snow was falling. It dusted the split rails of the fence and settled on the bare branches of the apple trees like powdered sugar. The Bell house glowed warm at the windows, yellow light spilling out onto the white yard. Smoke curled from the chimney in a slow, lazy ribbon. Old Jack stood at the gate for a long moment before he opened it. He told a neighbor later that he felt something watching him from the dark line of the trees, something patient and old and not unkind, but not friendly either. Inside, the family welcomed him with the quiet relief of people who have run out of ideas. John Bell sat by the hearth, his face drawn, his cheek twitching from the strange palsy that had begun to take him. Lucy Bell offered old Jack a cup of cider, and her hands shook only a little as she poured. Betsy sat in the corner with her knees pulled up, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. The room smelled of wood smoke and cornbread and something else, something faintly sharp, like the air just before a thunderstorm breaks. Old Jack opened his Bible. He read from the book of Psalms, the verses about the shadow of the valley, the verses about the rod and the staff. His voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had buried 2 wives and 4 children, and still trusted the words on the page. The family bowed their heads. The fire popped. The snow kept falling outside the dark windows. For a long while, nothing happened. The room grew warm. Old Jack closed his eyes and began to pray aloud, asking the Lord to drive the unclean spirit from the house and from the girl. The candles burned low. Lucy started to weep softly into her apron. And then, just as old Jack reached the part where he asked for protection in the name of the Father, the voice came. It came from the air above the table, clear as a bell rung in still water. And it spoke the words of the prayer back to him, not mocking, not angry. The voice spoke each word along with him, perfectly in time, perfectly in tune, as if it were praying too. When old Jack stopped, the voice stopped. When he started again, The voice followed. It knew the verses. It knew them better than he did. When his memory slipped on a passage, the voice carried on alone, reciting scripture in a soft female tone, beautiful and sad, like a woman singing a hymn in an empty church. That is the detail. That is the thing that should not be possible. The witch, the thing, whatever it was, knew the Bible. It could pray. It could quote chapter and verse. It joined old Jack Johnson in his prayers, as if it had been raised in a country chapel just like he had. And when he finished and sat back in his chair, the voice thanked him kindly for the visit and wished him a safe walk home through the snow. Old Jack walked back to his farm that night in a daze. The snow had stopped, and a thin moon hung over the hills like a silver coin. He did not speak of what he had heard until weeks later, and even then, only to a few. He never said the witch was a demon. He never said it was a soul in torment. He only said that whatever was in that house could speak the words of God without flinching. And that troubled him more than any howl or any curse ever could. A demon, the old preachers always said, cannot bear the holy word. A demon flees from Scripture. A demon burns at the sound of prayer. But the thing at the Bell Farm did not flee. It did not burn. It joined in. And to this day, nobody has ever explained what kind of spirit prays along with you in the dark. Not everyone on the Red River believed the story. Even back in 1818, with the knocks rattling through the Bell House most nights, there were neighbors who shook their heads and chuckled into their coffee. Farmers are practical people. They have crops to worry about, and weather, and the price of tobacco. A talking spirit on a farm down the road sounded like the kind of tale a bored child might invent on a long winter evening. One of those skeptics was a young man named Richard Powell. He was the school teacher in Adams, a lean fellow with quick eyes and ink-stained fingers. He taught Betsy Bell her letters in a one-room schoolhouse with a pot-bellied stove and a single window that looked out at a stand of yellow poplars. Powell was a reading man. He owned books, which was rare in that county. He had studied a little science, a little philosophy, and he did not believe in ghosts. When the stories began to spread, Powell listened politely and kept his thoughts to himself. He liked the bells. He liked Betsy especially, and he suspected, in the careful way of an educated man in a country town, that the trouble had a simple cause. Children sometimes invent things, lonely girls in particular. A house full of brothers, a quiet farm, long evenings with nothing to do but sit and stitch by candlelight. Powell thought the answer might be sitting at one of his own desks, braiding her hair while she worked her sums. He was not cruel about it. He never accused Betsy of lying. He simply watched her, the way a teacher watches a clever student, and he wrote down what he saw. Powell kept notes, quiet ones. He had a leather book with a string tied around it, and in that book he recorded the dates of the disturbances, who was present, what the voice said, and where Betsy stood when it spoke. He was trying to find the seam in the story, the place where the trick showed itself. The skeptics had real arguments. The voice spoke loudest when Betsy was in the room. The slaps that landed on her cheek left red marks that some said could have come from her own hand. Stones thrown by invisible fingers always seemed to fall in places where a girl with quick wrists could have thrown them herself. And the family, while honest folk, were the only ones who lived inside the walls. They controlled what visitors saw and when they saw it. Doctors of the day had a word they whispered for cases like this. Hysteria, they called it. A nervous condition, they said, common in young women on the edge of grown life. The body would do strange things. Limbs would shake. Voices would change. Some patients spoke in tongues they did not know. The skeptics pointed to that and nodded. A sad case, they said. A girl with a fevered mind, and a family too frightened to see it. Powell himself never wrote down a conclusion. His leather book, if it ever existed, has been lost to time. But the stories say he stayed close to Betsy through all of it, watching and listening. And he never once said in public that he had caught her cheating. Whatever he saw on those long evenings in the candlelit parlor, it did not give him the answer he wanted. That is the gap, the thing the skeptics cannot quite close. If Betsy was the source, she was a performer of impossible skill. The voice spoke when she was eating. It spoke when she was sleeping, witnessed by half a dozen grown men. It answered questions about Bible verses she had never read, in languages she had never studied. It quoted sermons from preachers 50 miles away, word for word, on the very nights those sermons were given. A clever girl might fool her father. She might fool her brothers. Fooling a whole county for 4 years, every night, with no one ever catching her in the act, is a different thing entirely. And Powell, the smartest doubter in Adams, eventually married Betsy Bell. He waited years until the witch was gone and the dust had settled, and then he stood with her under the poplars and made her his wife. Whatever he believed about her in private, he chose her in the end. He spent the rest of his life with the girl at the center of the strangest story in Tennessee. And so far as anyone knows, he never wrote a single word denying it. The skeptics had their reasons. They still do. But the silence of the man who watched most carefully has a weight of its own. Now here is where the story leaves the small farm and walks straight into the pages of American legend. Because the man who came to see the Bell Witch was not some country preacher or curious cousin from the next county over. He was the hero of New Orleans, the future 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson himself. The story goes that Jackson heard the tales from soldiers who had served under him, men from Robertson County who had marched with him in the Creek War. They sat around campfires and told him about the voice in the Bell House, about the slaps that came from empty air, about the little girl who could not sleep without something pulling the covers from her chin. Jackson was a man who believed in plain facts and hard ground, but he was also a man of his time, a time when the line between the real and the unreal was thinner than a sheet of writing paper. So, in the year 1819, by the telling of the old folks in Adams, the general loaded up a wagon and a small group of men and rode north from his home at the Hermitage. The road was rough red clay. The trees hung low over the trail like old men leaning on canes. He wanted to see this thing for himself. The believers who told this story later did not waver on the details. They named the spot where the wagon stopped. They named the men who rode along. They told it the same way every time, the way you tell a story you know in your bones. And when folks asked them if they really meant it, if Old Hickory had truly come to their little farm, they did not raise their voices or argue. They just nodded. They had seen it. That was the end of the matter. Picture the scene the way the old believers painted it. Late afternoon light, gold as honey, slanting through the bare branches of November. The Bell Farm sitting quiet at the bend of the river. Chimney smoke rising thin and straight into a sky the color of old pewter. And then, on the road, the rumble of wheels and the clop of hooves. A wagon coming around the last turn. 4 or 5 men on horseback in dark wool coats. Jackson himself riding tall, lean as a rail, his white hair brushed back from a face cut from limestone. They say the wagon got within sight of the house and then stopped. Just stopped. The wheels would not turn. The horses strained and snorted and dug their hooves into the clay. But the wagon sat there as if a great hand had laid itself across the axle. The men climbed down. They checked the wheels. They checked the harness. Nothing was wrong. Nothing they could see. And then, the story says, a voice spoke from the empty air above the road. Calm, almost polite. It told the general he could go on now. He had been tested. The wagon could move. Jackson, by the telling, looked at his men and said something close to this. By the eternal, boys, that is the witch. The believers held that line like a hymn. They repeated it for 100 years. By the eternal, that is the witch. It became the words you said when you wanted to prove the story was real. Because if Andrew Jackson said it, then it happened. And if it happened, then everything else the bells had been saying for 2 years was true too. Now the skeptics will tell you there is no letter from Jackson about any of this. No entry in his papers. No mention in the careful records his aides kept of his travels. The visit, they say, may never have happened at all. It may have grown out of campfire talk and the natural pull of a famous name toward a famous story. But the believers did not need a letter. They had something stronger than paper. They had grandfathers who swore on Bibles. They had aunts who pointed at the very spot in the road. They had a whole town that grew up hearing the tale told the same way, year after year, generation after generation. To them, the proof was the telling itself. The way the words had been handed down like a piece of good silver, polished by every mouth that spoke them. That is the strange power of this part of the story. Whether or not Jackson ever truly came to the Bell Farm, the legend says he did. And the people who believed it spoke with a calm certainty that no historian's footnote could ever shake loose. They say the road into Adams looks different at dusk. The sky there goes the color of old pewter, with streaks of rose along the western tree line. The ground rolls in soft hills like a quilt left rumpled on a bed. Black walnut trees lean over the lanes, their branches knit together so tight the sun has to fight its way through. And somewhere in those hills, the story goes, General Andrew Jackson's wagon came to a hard stop. The wheels just quit turning. The horses pulled, their muscles rolling under their hides like ropes under wet cloth. But the wagon would not move. The road was flat. The dirt was dry. There was no mud, no stone, no rut. The men climbed down and checked the axles. They checked the spokes. They ran their hands along the wheel rims and found nothing wrong. The wagon sat there in the gold evening light like a boat run aground on glass. Jackson, so the tale goes, stood in the road and looked off toward the Bell Farm in the distance. The fields lay quiet. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. He pulled off his hat, wiped his brow, and laughed a low laugh that did not have much joy in it. By all that's holy, he is said to have muttered, "It must be the witch." And then, just like that, the wheels turned again. The horses jolted forward, as if released from an invisible hand. The men nearly fell over backward. The wagon rolled on toward the farm as easy as butter on a hot pan, and no one in that party ever forgot the moment the road had said no, whether it happened that way or not. Folks in Adams will tell you the land itself remembers. They'll point to certain spots along the old wagon trace where the trees grew crooked, where the trunks curl away from a low piece of ground, as if leaning back from something they saw. They'll show you a meadow off the main road, where the grass comes up thin and pale, even in a wet spring. Cattle won't graze there. Deer cross around it. The bees that hum through the clover seem to skirt the edge and never settle in the middle. is a place near the old Bell property where folks tried to build more than once over the long years. Foundations went down, stones were laid, mortar was mixed and smoothed. Each time something went wrong, the corners would crack, the sills would warp, a wall would settle 2 inches in a single night, though the ground beneath looked solid as a church floor. The builders would shrug, gather their tools, and walk away. The place stayed empty. It still is. The Red River bends near where the Bells lived, and old farmers say the bend is not where it used to be. The water moved sometime in the years after John Bell died. It cut a new path through the bottomland and left an old curve behind as a long, still pond. That pond sits there yet, the color of weak tea, with willow trees hanging their hair down to drink. Frogs sing there in the summer. The fish in it are pale and slow. Children used to dare each other to swim across, and most would not. The cave on the property has its own long memory. The mouth of it opens in a limestone bluff, gray and wet, hung with moss the color of old copper. Cold air pours out of it even on the hottest July afternoon. You feel it on your skin from 20 feet away, like opening an ice house. Birds nest in the rocks above the mouth, but never inside. Bats live deeper in, but the front chamber stays empty. The locals say animals know what people sometimes forget. They know which ground to walk and which ground to leave alone. And the wagon story keeps coming back, generation after generation, told on porches and around stoves, and in the small, clean rooms of country churches. Some folks say it never happened. They say Jackson never came to Adams at all, that no record of the visit exists, that the whole tale was stitched together later by people who wanted a famous name in their story. Others say of course he came. He lived not 80 miles away. He knew the Bells through mutual friends. The papers of the time were thin and easily lost, and absence of proof is not proof of absence. Both could be true. Both could be false. The road is still there, running between hills the color of deer hide, and the wagon wheels are long gone. But the silence on that stretch, when the wind dies down at evening, has a weight to it, as if the land is still listening for something to pass. before we follow Betsy down to the spring, it helps to step back and look at the wider picture. Because the strange thing about the Bell Farm is not how unusual it was. The strange thing is how familiar it feels when you set it beside other tales. Take the matter of Joshua Gardner. Joshua was a fine young man from a neighboring farm, tall and steady, with dark hair and a soft way of speaking. He and Betsy had known each other since they were small. By the time she was 16, they were promised to each other, and folks in Adams thought it was a fine match. Two good families, two good farms, a wedding by the river when the dogwoods bloomed. But the voice in the Bell house would not have it. From the very first time Joshua's name was spoken aloud in those rooms, the unseen thing began to plead. Please, Betsy, please do not marry Joshua Gardner. Over and over, like a song with one verse. Sometimes gentle, sometimes weeping, sometimes sharp as a knife on a whetstone. The voice never said why. It only said no. Now hold that picture in your mind. A young girl, a spirit that follows her, a forbidden love. Because the same shape of story shows up in other corners of this country, told by other people in other years. Go up to Connecticut, to a quiet farming town called Stratford in the year 1850. A man named Eliakim Phelps lived there in a fine white house with tall windows. His stepdaughter was a girl of about Betsy's age, and one spring morning, the Phelps family came home from church to find every chair turned upside down, every cloth pulled from every table, and small figures made of clothing arranged on the floor like dolls at prayer. The knocking started soon after, then the writing on walls, then the throwing of stones from nowhere. The girl was at the center of it. Newspapers from New York sent reporters. Ministers came to pray, and like the Bell case, it faded after a few years, leaving no answer behind. Travel west and forward to Watseka, Illinois, in 1877. A young woman named Lurancy Venom began to speak in voices that were not her own. She named names of dead neighbors and spoke of places she had never been. Doctors came, pastors came, people wrote books, and again, the heart of the strangeness was a young woman in a country house with a family that did not know what to do. Travel south and back, coastal lowlands of South Carolina, where slave communities and old planter families both told stories of platies and haints, spirits that latched onto one child in a family and would not let go. Travel up to the cold farms of Vermont, where in the 1790s, only a generation before John Bell built his cabin, folks dug up their own dead kin to stop a wasting sickness they believed was the work of something unseen. Travel out to the Ozarks, where mountain women spoke of witch cats and singing stones and voices in the walls that knew the names of unborn children. The pattern, when you lay these stories side by side, is hard to miss. A rural family, a young daughter on the edge of womanhood, a presence that talks, knocks, throws, sings, weeps, a forbidden love or a sudden sickness, neighbors who come to listen, a few years of trouble, and then quiet. Folklorists have a name for this shape of tale. They call it the poltergeist pattern, from a German word that means noisy spirit. They have collected hundreds of cases across the world that fit it. The names change. The decades change. The voice in Tennessee says Kate. The voice in Connecticut says nothing at all. The voice in Illinois says it is somebody's dead aunt. But the bones of the story are the same bones. Some say this proves the Bell Witch was nothing more than a story shaped by the same forces that shaped all the others. A girl on the edge of marriage, a father whose word was law, a household pressed in by hard work and harder weather, a culture with no good way to speak about what cannot be spoken about. The voice in this telling was the family's own grief finding a door. Others say the opposite. They say the pattern proves the thing is real, because how else could folks in Tennessee and folks in Vermont and folks in Illinois, who never spoke and never met, tell the same story in the same shape across 100 years? Joshua Gardner did not know any of this. He only knew that he loved Betsy Bell, and something in her father's house would not let them be. There is a place on the old Bell farm where the ground slopes down to a small spring. The water comes up cold and clear from the limestone below. Ferns grow thick along the banks. In summer, the air there smells of wet stone and crushed mint. In winter, the spring still runs when everything else freezes solid. The locals call it the Bell Spring. People have walked down to it for more than 200 years now, just to stand near the water and listen. This is where Betsy Bell broke her engagement to Joshua Gardner. The story says it happened on a bright Easter Monday in 1821. She handed back the ring beside the spring, with the water running soft over the rocks, and she told him she could not marry him. She was crying when she said it. Joshua took the ring and walked away, and he never came back to court her again. What survives from that morning is small and strange. A few letters, a few lines in old family papers, a ring that some people swore was the same ring, passed down through Gardner relatives for years. Nobody can prove it was the same ring. Nobody can prove it wasn't. The most important artifact is a thin book bound in brown cloth. Richard Williams Bell, the youngest son, wrote it down in 1846, 25 years after his sister broke that engagement. He called the book Our Family Trouble. He was only 6 when the haunting began, and 26 years old when his older brother finally pushed him to write it all down before he forgot. The handwriting is careful and slow. The pages smell, even now, of old paper and the faint sweetness of pressed leaves. Richard wrote about the spring. He wrote about Betsy standing there with her face wet, and Joshua walking back through the field with his shoulders bent. He wrote that the voice they called Kate had warned Betsy for months, almost begging her not to marry that boy. The voice would whisper it at night through the wall. Please, Betsy, please do not marry Joshua Gardner. Sometimes the voice would weep. Sometimes it would shout. But it always came back to the same plea. The original manuscript was kept in the Bell family for decades. It moved from house to house, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into the bottoms of cedar chests. Photographs of the pages exist now in libraries and historical societies. You can see the ink fading at the edges. You can see where Richard pressed too hard with the pen, and where his hand seems to tremble a little when he wrote about his father's last days. There are other small things that survived. A silver thimble said to be Betsy's, kept in a glass case at a museum near Adams. A wooden chair from the Bell house, its seat worn smooth by 100 years of sitting. a piece of pine wallboard, dark with age, with 3 small dents in it that the family claimed were knocks the witch made one winter night. None of these things can be proven. Each of them carries the weight of a story. A photograph exists from the late 1800s, taken on the Bell Farm by a traveling man with a glass plate camera. It shows the old cabin half fallen in, with weeds growing through the porch boards. In the upper window, there is a smudge of pale light. Some people say it is only a flaw in the glass. Others have studied that photograph for years, trying to make the smudge into a face. It refuses to become anything you can name. A letter dated 1828 sits in a Tennessee archive. It was written by a woman in Springfield to her sister in Kentucky. She mentions the Bell girl in passing. She writes that Betsy Bell married a schoolteacher named Powell, and that the family seemed at peace at last, though Betsy's eyes still looked tired, even at her wedding. Just one line about Betsy. That is all, but it is enough to prove she existed. It is enough to prove the wedding happened. It is enough to prove that someone, somewhere, was already telling the story out loud. The spring still runs today. You can drive out to Adams, Tennessee, walk down the slope, and stand beside the water. The ferns are still there. The limestone is still cold. If you look hard, you can almost see 2 young people standing in the wet grass, one of them holding out a ring, the other crying. The artifacts are quiet things: a book, a thimble, a photograph, a letter. They do not shout. They wait, and they make the story harder to set down. The story of the little bottle has been told and retold around kitchen tables in Robertson County for more than 200 years. Every family in Adams seems to have a grandmother who heard it from her grandmother, and each version sits a little differently in the mouth of the teller. The bottle itself is small, the size of a thumb, made of dark glass that looks almost black until you hold it up to the light. Inside is a liquid no one ever named, thick and slow, the color of strong tea steeped too long. Some say it was found in the smokehouse, tucked behind a hanging side of bacon. Others say it was sitting plain as day on the mantel one morning, as if someone had set it there in the night. A few of the older tellings place it on the windowsill above John Bell's bed, where the winter sun would have struck it and turned the glass to a stone of dim ruby light. Where it came from, no one in the family could say. No peddler had stopped by. No neighbor had brought a tonic. The bottle simply was there, the way the knocks had simply been there, the way the voice had simply been there. By the time the children were grown and the grandchildren came around asking, the bottle had taken on a kind of weight in the telling. It had become the proof that something had been planning. The knocks could be wind. The voice could be a trick. But a bottle is a thing you can hold. A bottle has corners and edges and a stopper. A bottle does not happen by accident. Richard Williams Bell, who had been a boy of 7 when the trouble started, wrote about the bottle in his manuscript many years later. He remembered it sitting on the table the morning his father grew very sick. He remembered the smell of it, sharp and oily, like nothing in his mother's kitchen. He remembered his older brother John Jr. taking the stopper out, dipping a thin twig inside, and touching the wet end to the tongue of a barn cat. The cat, the story goes, twisted up and was gone before the clock could tick twice. That detail traveled. It traveled into the next generation and the one after, and then into the books and pamphlets that came in the late 1800s. Some tellers softened it. They said it was a stray dog. They said it was a chicken. A few brave grandmothers kept the cat in the telling, because the cat was what their own grandmothers had said, and you did not change what your grandmother said. Other parts of the story did get polished smooth. In the early tellings, the voice in the room laughed when the bottle was found. It said it had given the medicine to John Bell, said it had poured it down his throat while he slept. Later versions cleaned this up. The voice only hinted. The voice only suggested. By the time the story reached the school books and the tourist pamphlets, the bottle was a quiet object, mysterious and unexplained, sitting on the table like a question with no good answer. Some details fell out altogether. There was once a tale about a second bottle, smaller still, found in the wood box by the hearth. That one disappeared from the telling sometime around the Civil War, and no one in Adams seems to remember why. There was once a tale about a strange word written in pencil on the side of the larger bottle, a word in no language anyone knew. That one faded too, the way a name fades from a gravestone after enough winters. What stayed through every version and every teller was the core of it. A bottle appeared. The liquid inside was dark. The animal that tasted it did not live. John Bell took sick and grew weaker, and the voice in the walls laughed about it. That is the shape of the story as it sits today, worn smooth by 2 centuries of holiday tables and porch swings and bedtime tellings. The bottle itself, the actual object, was thrown into the fireplace by one of the older Bell boys. The flame, the family says, blew up the chimney and made a sound like a woman laughing. After that, the bottle was gone. No one ever found a shard of dark glass in the ashes. No one ever found the stopper. Whatever the thing had been, it left the way it had come, without explanation, without proof, leaving behind only a story that the family would carry forward into every quiet evening that followed. The morning was cold. December the 20th, in the year 1820. A thin frost lay on the fields like sugar spilled across a dark cloth, and the bare trees stood quiet around the Bell farmhouse. Smoke rose slow from the kitchen chimney. The smell of bacon and wood smoke drifted through the yard. Inside, the family moved as families do on winter mornings. Boots by the door, wool blankets pulled tight, a kettle starting to hum on the iron stove. John Bell did not come down the stairs. That part is simple. That part everyone agrees on. The old man, who had farmed this land for 14 years, who had cleared the trees and laid the fences and raised 7 children, did not rise from his bed that morning. His son went up to wake him and found him still, his breath shallow, his skin gray as ash. He never spoke another clear word. By that afternoon, he was gone. What followed is where the story splits in two, and where it has stayed split for 200 years. The family said they found a small dark bottle in the cupboard. They said the voice in the walls laughed and bragged of poisoning him. They said the witch sang songs at his graveside and would not let him rest. The newspapers, when they finally came calling, repeated all of it. The schoolteacher wrote it down. The neighbors swore to every word. And yet, step back from the bottle. Step back from the laughter. Step back from the voice that called itself Kate. What you have left is a quieter picture. An old man, sick for a long time. A family worn thin by years of strange nights. A daughter who had lost her engagement and her sleep and her color. A house that had become heavy with something nobody could name. Whatever you believe about the witch, this part is true. John Bell died tired. He died after years of something pulling at him, whether it pulled from inside his own body or from the air around his bed. His face had grown hollow. His tongue had swelled and gone still for days at a time. His hands had shaken. He had not been well, and he had not been well for a long, long time. The land outside his window did not care about the argument. The Red River kept running its slow brown path through the hills. The cedars kept their dark green needles through the frost. The corn stubble in the fields stood bent and silver. The cattle gathered near the barn the way cattle do, breathing white plumes into the cold air. The world went on, the way the world always does, when one old farmer slips out of it. Here is the part that matters more than the bottle, more than the voice, more than the question of whether a witch killed a man in the bend of the river. Something happened here. Something happened on this farm, between these people, in these 4 years, that mattered. It mattered enough that a son sat down 26 years later and wrote it all down by lamplight. It mattered enough that neighbors told it to their children, and those children told it to theirs, until the telling reached every porch in Robertson County. It mattered enough that a town grew up around the story and still listens for it. You can call it a haunting. You can call it a sickness of the mind that spread through a family, the way fever spreads through a household. You can call it a daughter in pain and a father in slow decline, and a community looking for a name to give what they could not understand. You can call it any of those things, and none of them quite cover it. What you cannot do is make it small. Whatever happened on the Bell farm reached too far. It pulled a future president up the Wagon road. It pulled preachers from 3 counties to kneel in the parlor. It pulled a schoolteacher to the kitchen night after night with his pen and his paper. It pulled the youngest daughter to break her own heart by a cold spring in the woods. And on a December morning, in a quiet, upstairs room. It pulled an old man out of this world before his time. The frost burned off by noon. The fields turned dark and wet under a pale sun. The family gathered in the parlor downstairs, and someone finally said the words out loud. "He's gone, he's gone." And the house, for the first time in a long time, was silent. But the silence did not last. The silence never lasts. Not in a story like this. Not in Adams, Tennessee. Picture the farm on the night after John Bell died. The sun has long since dipped behind the western ridge, leaving the sky the color of cold iron. A thin moon hangs low over the Red River, and its light spills across the bottomland like milk poured slow from a pitcher. The fields are quiet. The cattle stand still in the pasture, their breath rising in soft white plumes. You are standing at the edge of the yard, just past the well. The house behind you glows from a single window, where a lamp burns for the family inside. They are not sleeping. Nobody on this farm will sleep tonight. The log walls hold the murmur of voices, the soft tread of feet on plank floor, the rustle of black cloth being smoothed across a kitchen table. John Bell lies inside, washed and dressed, his hands folded over the front of his good Sunday shirt. Out here, though, the world feels wider than it has any right to be. The air smells of wood smoke and turned earth and the sharp green bite of cedar. A frost has settled on the long grass, and each blade carries a thin coat of silver that catches the moonlight when you move your head. The barn sits dark and square against the sky, its tin roof reflecting back a dull glimmer. Beyond it, the cornfields lie cut and stubbled, the broken stalks standing like rows of small gray soldiers. The river is down past the slope. You can hear it more than see it, a low, constant whisper running between its banks. The Red River does not roar. It mutters. It carries the sound of itself through the willows and the sycamores, through the bare branches that lean low over the water. Tonight the river sounds like a voice held just below words, like someone humming with their mouth closed. And then, from somewhere in the trees, the singing begins. It is soft at first, so soft you might think it is the wind moving through the high pines on the ridge. But the wind is still, not Not a breath stirs the dry leaves at your feet. The sound rises and falls in a slow, steady tune, a hymn maybe, though you cannot quite catch the words. It does not come from the house. It does not come from the road. It comes from the woods themselves, drifting between the trunks of the oaks and the bare arms of the hickories. The neighbors will speak of this for the rest of their lives. They will say the singing started the night John Bell passed and carried on through the funeral the next day. They will say it was a woman's voice, clear and high, with no trembling in it at all. Some will say there were two voices, weaving together like threads in a piece of cloth. Others will swear it was a whole choir, faint and far, singing from somewhere just past the tree line where no person stood. You stand and listen. The cold works its way up through the soles of your boots. Above you, the stars have come out in their thousands. The sky over Robertson County in 1820 is not the sky we know. There are no electric lights for 100 miles. The dark is a deep dark, an old dark, and the stars sit thick across it like spilled salt on black velvet. The Milky Way runs from horizon to horizon, a pale river of light mirroring the dark river below. A barred owl calls from somewhere off in the bottoms. Once, twice, then quiet. The singing keeps going. It does not feel sad exactly. It does not feel triumphant either. It feels like a thing being marked, a passage, a door closing somewhere out beyond the bend in the road where the lantern light cannot reach. Tomorrow the wagons will come. Friends and kin will gather in their dark coats and shawls. They will lower John Bell into the cold ground in the little family cemetery up the rise. The voice in the trees will sing through all of it, plain as a hymn from a Sunday service, and nobody will be able to find the singer. Men will search the woods with lanterns. They will find nothing but rabbit tracks and the deep prints of a passing deer. For now, though, it is only you and the night and the song. The farmhouse window glows behind you. The frost holds its silver. The river mutters. The stars wheel slow across the great dark bowl of the sky, indifferent and beautiful, and you are very small beneath them, and the world feels, for one long moment, both terribly old and perfectly still. After John Bell was laid in the ground, the family waited. They watched the corners of the rooms. They listened past the wind. The voice had said it would come back, and the voice had always told the truth, even when the truth was cruel. It returned in the spring of 1821. The knocks came again on the cabin walls, soft as a knuckle-tapping wood. The voice spoke to Lucy Bell in the kitchen while she kneaded bread. It spoke to the boys in the field while they broke the soil for planting. But the meanness was gone. Whatever fire had burned in Kate during John Bell's last years had cooled to a low ember, and what remained sounded almost tired. The voice stayed for a few weeks. It sang old hymns in the evenings. It spoke of small things, the weather, the calves, a memory of a wagon road in another county. Then one morning, it said a thing the family would repeat for the rest of their lives. It said it would go now, but it would come back in 7 years. Then the cabin was quiet, and the quiet held. 7 years passed slow on a Tennessee farm. The corn came up, and the corn came down. Lucy Bell grew older by the hearth, her hair silvering like frost on a fence rail. Betsy married a man named Richard Powell, the schoolteacher who had watched the whole strange business with careful eyes. The children scattered into their own lives. And in 1828, just as the voice had promised, something tapped on the walls of John Bell Jr.'s home. It stayed only a short while that second time. It spoke of things to come, of wars and changes, and a country that would tear itself in two. Then it left again, and this time it did not say when it would return. The family agreed among themselves not to speak of it much. But the land remembered, and the neighbors remembered, and the story had already grown roots too deep to pull. Adams, Tennessee, was barely a town then. Just a crossroads, a few cabins, a store, a meeting house. But after the Bell business, travelers began to come. They came on horseback in the 1830s and in buggies in the 1850s, and on the new railroad in the 1880s. They came to stand at the edge of the Bell field and look at the cabin and ask the old folks what they had heard with their own ears. The old folks always had something to say. A schoolteacher named Martin Van Buren Ingram gathered the stories in the 1890s and put them in a book. He walked the back roads with a notebook stub of pencil and sat on porches with men and women whose grandparents had been at the Bell Farm when the voice still spoke. The book went out into the world, and the world read it, and the world wrote back asking for more. The town grew up around the legend, the way moss grows up around a stone. Children in Adams learned the story before they learned long division. Farmers pointed out the bend in the Red River where the cabin had stood. Old women warned grandchildren away from certain hollows after dark, not because they were truly afraid, but because the warning was part of the place, like the smell of wood smoke in November. In time, the town built a festival around it. Every autumn, when the leaves on the hickories turned the color of beaten copper, and the air went sharp with the first cold, people came from all over to walk the Bell land. They came to a small wooden cabin that had been built to honor the old one. They came to hear storytellers under string lights, their voices soft against the dark beyond the fairgrounds. Children carried paper lanterns. Old men sat in folding chairs and nodded along to stories they had heard 100 times and would hear 100 times more. A particular way of looking at the world settled into Adams and never quite left. Folks there will tell you they do not exactly believe in ghosts, and they do not exactly disbelieve either. They have learned to leave a little room for the unexplained. They listen when the wind moves through the cedars in a certain way. They notice when a dog stares at an empty corner of the kitchen. They do not always say what they think it means. The witch had promised to come back once more in 107 years from her second visit. That would have been 1935. People in Adams watched that year careful and quiet. Some said they heard her. Some said they did not. The story, like the land itself, kept its own counsel. There is a cave on the Bell Farm. It sits in a limestone bluff above the Red River, its mouth shaped like a low stone yawn. Cool air drifts out of it, even in summer, smelling of wet rock and old water. The children of Adams have been crawling into that cave for 200 years now. They go in with lanterns and come out with stories. One of those children was a boy named Charles Bailey Bell. He was a great-grandnephew of John Bell himself, born long after the Troubles ended. He grew up hearing the stories at the supper table from aunts and uncles who spoke them low and slow. He listened the way only children can listen, with his whole body still. Charles left Tennessee as a young man. He studied medicine and became a respected doctor in Nashville, with a fine office and a brass nameplate on the door. He wore neat suits and carried a leather bag. He set bones and delivered babies and signed death certificates in careful, looping ink. By every measure, he was a man of science. But the cave stayed with him. The voice that had spoken to his great-grandfather stayed with him. He carried that farm in his coat pocket like a stone he could not throw away. In 1934, more than 100 years after John Bell died, Dr. Charles Bailey Bell sat down and wrote a book. He called it The Bell Witch, a mysterious spirit. He wrote it in the calm, measured hand of a physician describing a patient. He wrote it because he believed the story was true, and because he was afraid that without him, the last family memory of it would fade like breath on glass. In his book, Charles claimed the witch had returned. She had come back to the Bell family, just as she promised, 107 years after she first left. He said she had visited his own grandfather, John Bell Jr., and spoken of things to come. Wars, inventions, the slow turning of the country. Charles wrote it all down as a quiet act of faith. Doctors who knew him shook their heads gently. They liked Charles. They respected his hands and his bedside manner. They simply did not know what to do with the book. He had stepped out of the lit hallway of science and into a darker room, and he had taken a candle with him. The book sold. It found its way into farmhouses across the South, into the hands of teachers in Kentucky, into mail-order catalogs that shipped to Texas and Iowa. Wherever it went, the cave by the river went with it. Readers in flat prairie towns closed their eyes and saw a Tennessee bluff they had never visited. They smelled wet limestone in their own dry living rooms. That is how the story walks. It walks on the backs of people who leave home. A daughter marries a man from Missouri and packs the legend in her trunk between linen and a Bible. A cousin moves to California for the orange groves and tells the tale at a porch party in Pasadena. A soldier from Robertson County sits in a trench in France and whispers about a voice that called itself Kate, just to remind himself that home is real. Charles Bailey Bell died in 1945. He was buried in Nashville, not in Adams, but his book kept walking. It crossed into the work of folklorists and ghost hunters. It became a source that other writers quoted, then a source those writers quoted, until the chain grew so long that nobody could see back to the farm at the end of it, and the cave itself stayed where it had always been. Today, it sits behind a wooden gate. A small wooden cabin stands near it, built to look like the old Bell home, though the true house burned long ago. Visitors pay a small fee and walk down a path through the trees. Guides lead them to the cave mouth and tell them to listen. Some hear nothing but the river. Some swear they hear a voice, a whisper in the stone, the sound of a woman humming a tune she has half forgotten. The guides smile and shrug. They have heard it all before, and they make no promises. What echoes in that cave is not just sound. It is the long line of people who refused to let the story die. Charles, sitting at a desk in Nashville with his pen scratching. The ants at the supper table. The neighbors who came to listen by lamplight. Each one passed the legend to the next set of waiting hands, the way you might pass a candle down a dark hallway, careful not to let the flame go out. A story like this should have stayed small. It should have lived inside one farmhouse, then faded with the people who knew it. Most ghost tales do. They burn bright for a season, then wash away like footprints in soft mud. The Bell Witch did not. She walked out of that hollow in Robertson County and somehow found her way into the whole country's memory. Think about how strange that is. In 1820, the Bell Farm sat at the end of a dirt road in a county most Americans had never heard of. There were no telegraph wires yet, no newspapers reaching every porch, no photographs. Stories traveled the way wagons traveled, slow and tired, kicking up dust mile by mile. And yet, somehow, the tale of old Kate slipped past every barrier. It moved first by mouth. Farmhands who had stood in the Bell parlor carried the story home to their own kitchens. Preachers brought it into their sermons as a warning. Soldiers who had served under Andrew Jackson swore they had heard the general himself tell it. His eyes narrow, his voice low, his finger tapping the table for emphasis. The story spread through Tennessee like seed on the wind, then crossed into Kentucky, then into the Carolinas. By the 1840s, travelers in the Mississippi Delta were trading versions of it over card tables and steamboat railings. Then came the writing down. Richard Williams Bell, the youngest son who had been only 6 when the trouble began, set pen to paper in 1846. His manuscript was called Our Family Trouble, and he wrote it as a private remembrance, not a book for the world. The pages were yellow and brittle. The ink had the rust color of old blood. For decades, that little stack of papers sat in a drawer waiting. Then in 1894, a newspaperman named Martin Van Buren Ingram pulled the story into print. His book had a long title and a heavy cover. The pages smelled of fresh glue and warm paper. Ingram gathered every scrap he could find. He used Richard's manuscript. He talked to old neighbors whose hair had gone white and whose hands shook when they signed their names. He printed the whole tale, voice and all, and sent it out into the world. After that, the witch belonged to everyone. The book traveled by rail to libraries in Chicago and Boston and New York. Folklorists picked it up and wrote about it in journals with thin paper and small print. Magazine writers retold it for city readers who had never smelled a tobacco field or heard a whippoorwill at dusk. A silent film studio looked at it. Radio shows borrowed the bones of it. By the time the 20th century rolled in, the Bell Witch was no longer a Tennessee secret. She was an American one. What carried her so far? That is its own small mystery. Other ghost stories from the same era have gone quiet. The names have faded. The farms have been plowed under. But this one stayed. Maybe it was the sheer number of witnesses. Maybe it was the name of Andrew Jackson tied to it, lending the weight of a president's word. Maybe it was Betsy, the bright young girl at the center, whose suffering felt real to anyone who had ever loved a daughter. Maybe it was the way the voice had a personality. Kate was not a moan in the rafters. She was someone. She had opinions and songs and cruel jokes. People remember a character. They forget a noise. The story crossed the country, and then it crossed the ocean. British writers picked it up in the early 1900s. Researchers in Europe compared it to their own house spirits, their own poltergeist cases, their own legends of voices in the walls. The Bell Witch became part of a larger conversation about what might or might not be possible in the quiet hours of a country house at night. And still, after 200 years, nobody can say what really happened on that farm. The records are thick. The witnesses agreed on the broad shape of things. The voice was heard by too many to be one person's lie. But the truth at the center of it stays hidden, tucked behind a curtain that no historian has been able to pull aside. That is the open door. That is why the story keeps walking. Every generation reads it for the first time and feels the same small chill, the same small wonder. Every generation asks the same question, and the answer keeps its silence, the way the Tennessee woods keep theirs, the way Kate herself promised she would before she stepped back into the dark and left only her name behind. And so the fire burns low now. The wood has gone to soft red coals, glowing like little hearts inside the ash. The night around you is deep and quiet, the way only late nights are, when even the wind has gone to sleep in the trees. The story has been told. The story is never finished. Out in Robertson County, Tennessee, the land does what land does. The Red River bends slow through the dark. The fields rest under a thin silver of moonlight. The cedars stand the way they have stood for 200 years, patient and tall, holding the cold in their needles. Somewhere out there is the small town of Adams, a few streetlights, a gas station, a handful of porches with the lamps still on, and under all of it, the old story, still humming like a wire in the ground. People still come to Adams. They come in the bright months when the corn is high and the dust rises off the country roads. They come with maps printed off the internet, looking for the cave by the river, looking for the field where the strange black dog ran along the fence, looking for the spot where the cabin used to stand. They walk soft. They speak in low voices. They take pictures of trees that look like any other trees and rocks that look like any other rocks. And they go home, and they cannot say exactly what they felt, only that they felt it. The town itself has made a kind of peace with the witch. There are signs. There is a little museum. There is a replica cabin where you can stand in the dim light and listen to the floorboards creak, the way old floorboards always creak, and wonder. The people who live there mostly shrug when you ask. Some of them smile. Some of them say their grandmother heard something once, a long time ago, and would not speak of it. Some of them say it is all a story made up to sell postcards. Both can be true. In a town like Adams, both usually are. What no one denies is that the story stayed. It crossed the mountains. It crossed the rivers. It rode in the saddlebags of preachers and the trunks of schoolteachers. It got written down in a child's hand in 1846 and printed in thick black ink in 1894 and whispered around 1,000 campfires in between. It outlived John Bell. It outlived Betsy Bell. It outlived the cabin and the barn and the cornfield and the road that led to them. Stories like this do not survive by accident. They survive because something in them rings true to the people who hear them, even when the people cannot say what. Maybe it was a haunting. Maybe it was a frightened girl in a hard country and a family that loved her